As you know, within the last hour, the Senate acquitted President Trump on both articles of impeachment. The Democratic-led House had accused him of obstructing justice and abusing power of his office. All of this stemming from the allegations he pressured Ukraine to open an investigation into Joe Biden and his son. It is an outcome that did not surprise many, given the Republican majority in the U.S. Senate. Both of Georgia's Republican senators voted along party lines. The only Republican to break party line was the former Republican presidential candidate and current Utah Senator Mitt Romney, who voted to convict him for abuse of power. Here's how he explained his decision before the vote.
The president asked a foreign government to investigate his political rival. The president withheld vital military funds from that government to press it to do so. The president delayed funds for an American ally at war with Russian invaders. The president's purpose was personal and political. Accordingly, the president is guilty of an appalling abuse of public trust.
Senator Romney joined the rest of the Republicans in voting not guilty on obstruction of Congress. We will have more on the reaction to this vote coming up in about 22 minutes at 5:30.